Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are coming from. It's Michelle Brown here from mixedmediaart.net, and I'm so excited to be bringing you our Creating Layers in Mixed Media Art online tutorial today. Whether you're just getting started out in mixed media art or you've been mucking around with it for a while, I hope you'll find some things today that will give you inspiration, to give you some encouragement and some enthusiasm to go and try a few of these techniques and to just get started and experiment. Give yourself permission to play, permission to create. So today we'll be looking at a 30-minute presentation with time for some questions. So we'll cover a range of techniques that we can use for creating layers in our mixed media artwork. And these techniques apply equally whether we're creating canvases, whether it's an art journal, whether it's an altered book, whether it's a piece of cereal box cardboard, whatever it may be. And I'm not the world's expert on creating mixed media art. These are the things that I have found to work. So I want to share some of them with you, but also give you permission to go and create things on your own. So when did I start considering creating layers? When I first got started in mixed media art, I would look at different work online and in the glossy magazines, and I would just love looking at the richness, the texture, the visual interest in these pieces. And it was all these layers, but my artwork never looked like that. And it took me quite a while to realize, as silly as it may sound, that to create this richness in our mixed media art, to have all these layers, we actually had to create all these layers. The artist needed to put them down. So that was the first step, acknowledging that to create rich work, we needed to be able to put all the layers together. Then it was a matter of finding out how to do it. And I've taken numerous courses, both online and in person, and many hours of experimentation, as well as gathering up some products on the way. So I wanted to look today and talk about how these layers can go down, what order they can go in, what works and what doesn't work. And again, it's no hard and fast rules because it's mixed media art, and that's what we love about it. Anything goes. There's no right or wrong. But these are the things that I've found to work. And we'll talk about some of those variations as well, when we can experiment, and other times when we might want to stick to just a few of the rules. So for those of you that have been hanging around mixed media art for a while now, whether you've got our technique sheets or looking at our online step-by-steps, you know that we always have a materials and tools list at the start. It's really hard to create fantastic pieces if we don't know what's been used to create them. So today we're going to use some 5" by 7" canvas board. These come in usually packs of 3 and they're relatively inexpensive. But if you're finding you need to create right this afternoon or perhaps in the morning, for those of you that's getting a little bit late, and you don't have any canvas board or an art journal at hand, then it doesn't matter. Go grab whatever you've got. As you all know by now, cereal box cardboard is one of my favorite substrates for creating mixed media art. It's easy to find, it's easy to convert into something real, and again, because it's a cheap material, it gives us permission to just be creative and play, not be worrying that we're wasting materials. I've got endless amounts of materials that I don't want to use because it's the good paper or the good paint. And of course, if we don't use our equipment and our materials, then the paints will go off, they'll go gluggy, the glues will dry out, and then we have really wasted our money. So again, I want to encourage you to use what you've already got, find different ways of adapting it, and give yourself permission to use the good stuff. I don't believe that she who dies with the most stuff wins. We need to use it up and generate our creativity as we go. So as well as the canvas board, we're going to talk about some gesso, acrylic paints, and talk about how to choose colours, especially when you're starting off and all those colours seem a bit scary. Talking about paper ephemera or using the bits and pieces that we can collect to add interesting layers in our artwork. Some mediums including gel medium and varnish. And then some embellishments, which includes our tissue paper and images, some hearts, and the rub-on lettering. Now the tools are kept nice and simple. We're going to be using some rubber stamps and also some found objects. So for those of you that have been following along with the Mixed Media Art Techniques video, some of these found objects will look very familiar to you because these are my 3 absolute go-to things that I tend to use in many of my pieces. And of course we'll use some paintbrushes. Now I have a paintbrush that I reserve just for gesso and one that I have just for gel medium and one that I have just for varnish. on one of our conversations over on our Facebook page recently, it was pointed out to me that a brush used in acrylic paint or in gesso will be fine. It's no cross-contamination there as long as we clean it out. Having said that, I still like to have my separate brushes and do my very best to keep them clean whenever possible. So let's go and create our first layer. If you don't know where to start with a layer of gesso. Now, gesso is one of those must-have products. There are very few products that I will tell you today that you need to go out and buy. If you're just getting started out, though, I really do suggest that you go and find the smallest container of gesso that you can so that you can have a play with it. You can see how it goes to create interesting backgrounds. You can use it in a resistance technique. You can use it to put a wash over something if it's bright and needs a bit of consolidating. So the gesso has special properties that help bind things together, and it is expensive, and there are ways of creating your own. We will have a follow-up series on that soon. But my suggestion, if you're getting started, is go and buy a small container and experiment with it, see what you can do. So for the canvas board, you can see here, I added a thickish layer of gesso with a paintbrush, sort of in a crisscross motion. I tend to like that texture. And then I used a stick or a skewer to do some squiggles in it. And again, don't overthink this. Just do some squiggles, add a word in or some writing, or just make some marks. It's hard to know at this stage what will show up in the final pieces and what won't. At this point, I really try not to have an idea or a picture in my head of what this might look like when I've finished, because otherwise I'm just going to be disappointed with what I do. So at the moment, we're just going to have fun and play. So once we've got the gesso on and we've put some squiggles in it, we need to let it sit aside and dry. I've always got a heat gun handy, but I don't tend to use it for the gesso. I find that it's much better to be left air dried. So if you can plan ahead, if that's at all possible, to try and do this the night before and then let it dry properly before we push ahead. So next we want to gather up some ephemera, some bits and pieces of paper that are sheets from books. It could be dictionary pages. There's knitting pattern there. Some of you might recognise those for our ephemera kits that we'd sold last year. And all different sizes of fonts and pictures. What I then do is to tear them into the shapes that I'm looking for. I find that by tearing the edges, it gives a bit of a feathered transition. So as we stick it to the background, it makes it a bit easier to blend in. I usually, again, don't think too much about this, but try and keep it to odd number of pieces. Again, that's just one of those general rules and layouts. So for the first piece, I've added 3 horizontal pieces. For the middle one, we've gone for a more diagonal layout, and that's actually to line up with the gesso markings that I've put on there as well. And then the third one, I've added a little bit of ephemera to the top and the bottom. Now, my preference for sticking these down is with a gel medium, but if you haven't got gel medium, then a good craft glue or a PVA will work just fine. If you've only got a glue stick, make sure you add a really good layer. I quite often find that glue sticks just don't always hold up to the rigours of mixed media art. As we add more layers of varnish and paints and other things, the glue stick tends to get a little bit fragile and come apart. So again, use that gel medium if you've got it, or if you've got Mod Podge, that's an equal sort of product. Add a little bit onto the canvas, a little bit underneath, and then use your paintbrush to just put a little bit on and make sure that it's stuck down really well. We want to get all those corners to make sure they don't start lifting up. And again, this is one of those processes that we don't really want to speed up by using a heat gun. So we're better off sitting that aside, letting it dry properly while we go find and explore some paints and colours to use. So now we get to the fun part. We can start adding some colour. Now I'm using 3 different colours here. My best go-to rule, or the easy way to get started when you're not sure how to mix colours, and believe me, I'm no expert, I'm certainly not formally trained in any sort of arts. I like to choose 2 matching colours and a white or an off-white. So here we've chosen a pinky or a magenta colour and a purple. You could also try a light and a dark blue or a light and a dark green. And what we're looking for in these colour combinations is that as we add the white in to create different shades, that they still all match, because we don't want to be worrying about what the colours look like once we've finished. So those analogous colours, the ones that work together, are a good place to start, particularly when you're just starting out. So I'm using a paint palette, which is just a styrofoam meat tray. It could just as easily be an old plate. And I usually have 3 to 6 brushes on hand, one for each of the base colours. And then as I mix the colours, I have a separate brush for that as well. So usually by the time I'm finished, I have a bit of a mess. But then I ensure that I've got the different brushes for each of the coloured paint. So for the first canvas, I started with some of the dark purple, added in some of the magenta, and then as I blended them together, used those colours in between. Similarly for the middle one, I started off with the dark colours and then pulled it into the light. And by the third canvas, we were starting to get a little bit more watered down, a little bit lighter, so you can see that that's generally a lighter colour. There's a few different ways to blend our paints when they touch. We can use a lighter colour that we've mixed on the palette. We can drag some of the darker colour over the lighter colour. We can also add a little bit of water to the brush and use that to swish around in the border. Or even use some paper towel and use that to blot it off. What you'll find though, there is a point where it just needs to be left and to be dried. If you find that all you're doing is making more of a homogeneous background with whatever colour you end up with when you mix these three together, then it really is time to just step back and let those layers dry. Even if you're not happy with how they're interfacing, how they're transitioning, once it's dry, it's then much easier to come back and add a little bit of that colour over the top so it's not quite as strong between the two colours. Then, of course, we need to let those paints dry before we head up any further. So quite often at this stage, when I've decided I have to stop because I'm just going to make a bigger mess of it, I've usually got some paint left over on the palette. What I like to do with that paint is have a few watercoloured paper art journals. And the technique for creating these will be in our next series of mixed media art technique sheets, which will be out in September. There we can just play with the paint. We can see what it looks like when we really water it down and wash it around. We can see what it looks like when it mixes with the colours. We can practice some of our paintbrush strokes. But again, as we keep adding layers up, it gets more and more towards this one colour. So at a point, we need to sit the art journals aside to dry as well, and then go and wash up. So wash our 5 or 6 brushes, wash our palette, wash out our paintbrush, get them all dry, and be ready to start again. So once I've repeated that process 2 or maybe 3 times, it tends to be time to stop with the main paint colours. Again, knowing when to stop is one of the challenging parts of creating mixed media art. It's only through experimentation that you find when you get to a point where it's good versus when you go too far and it's just becoming all very homogeneous. So again, following along on these steps will certainly help. So for these pieces, I decided I needed a swirl stamp, and the swirl stamps are my absolute favourite. And this is one from the Buzz and Bloom collection. And I like using the Stazon ink, in this case in jet black. Stazon's a solvent-based ink pad, and the reason that we use that in mixed media art is that we're pretty sure it will dry on most of the surfaces that we'll use in mixed media art. The challenge, of course, though, is for those of you that have used Stazon, it's a very dry ink pad, so it doesn't tend to give us a really good coverage of ink onto the stamp and then onto the canvas when the surface isn't perfectly even. So you can see in the top right-hand piece, that swirl, you can actually see the canvas lines coming through on the image. Now, I don't mind that. That's the effect I'm going for when I do this stamping. I'm not looking for a really solid image. I'm just looking for the impression of the images. If you're looking for something much solider, we either need to draw it or we need to stamp onto the tissue paper. And we'll talk about adhering the tissue paper in the next step. So because I was working on 3 pieces at once, I wanted to tie those elements together. So I just used the one stamp and put it in different places on the canvas. I also then rotated the stamp and just used parts of it, again to use that common theme, but adding some interest in different sections. Usually with the Stazon ink, there's no need to heat set it. It will dry on itself, and it usually does dry fairly quickly. So then we want to add some tissue with varnish. And there's 2 different methods that we've used here. The first one is to use some dress pattern tissue. I've inherited a whole heap of that from my grandmother, who's no longer able to make all her beautiful dresses. So when I've had paint left over, like in one of the earlier stages, not only have I done some painting in my art journals, but also added some paint onto this dress pattern tissue. It comes in some fairly good sizes, and again, it gives you an opportunity to see how the paints mix together what they look like, and then it gives you all this wonderful, wonderful background material that we can add to our mixed media artwork. With the little nymph there, I've actually printed that onto the tissue paper using the mixed media art technique process that we had in our first bundle of printing them onto our own white tissue. I like to tear around the edges, similar to the ephemera, because then it makes it easier to feather the outer parts of that tissue into the background, because we want just the image there. We don't want the tissue to stick out. I like using the varnish to stick the tissue paper on because I find it gives a really good adhesion and it helps make that tissue paper disappear. So the process that I tend to use, the one that works for me most times, is by adding a little bit of varnish onto the canvas first, then adding a thin layer onto the back of the tissue, and then as we're pressing the tissue onto the canvas, starting in the middle and then slowly working our way out, either with the brush or with a damp finger, if you're not too worried about getting a bit messy. What we're trying to do is make sure all the bubbles are out from under this and make sure that it's got a really good adhesion to the background, because that's the best way to get it to sit into the piece. Likewise with the dress pattern tissue paper, just starting in the middle and working the way out. Of course, if you're looking for something with a bit more texture, there's no reason why you can't stick it on and make it a little bit more crinkly. But in this case, I was looking for a smooth adhesion. I like to leave this to dry naturally as well. I find if you do try and speed it up with a heat gun, if there are any little bubbles under the tissue paper, they tend to expand and you'll end up with a bubble that will either leave a bump in the image or possibly a tear if it actually bursts or you try and fix it. So it's best to leave that, sit overnight or a few hours if you're somewhere warm, and that will dry off nicely. While you've got the varnish out, you may as well give the whole piece a layer of varnish, because then it takes that tissue paper and blends it in with the backgrounds and really helps consolidate that background so we can head off for our subsequent steps. So now one of my favorite layers is using our found objects and doing some stamping with them. So for those of you that have seen our mixed media art technique video, there's my bottle cap, my go-to bottle cap that I use on all sorts of pieces, and a little bit of bubble wrap. For this one, I've wrapped it around a wooden mounted rubber stamp because that gives it something to hold on to rather than just trying to deal with a floppy bit of plastic that's covered with paint. And the third thing I've used here is a piece of sequin scrap or punchinella and a dry brush. The secret of found object stamping is firstly not to expect a really good impression. That's not what we're trying to achieve here. We're just trying to create some interesting marks. The second thing is to apply the paint onto the palette and then use a paintbrush for applying the paint onto the object. The challenge here is to not end up with too much paint on it, because when we stamp it out, we'll just end up with blobby messes. And again, it's taken me a little while to realize that. I'm a bit like a bull in a china shop when it comes to my mixed media art. It's get out of my way, here we go. But that often results in all sorts of interesting blobs and usually not quite the look I'm looking for. Though, of course, it's mixed media art, and if that works for you, then that's fine. But just use the paintbrush to add that little bit of paint to the surface, stamping it out in various locations across the 3 canvases. So I've used straight white paint for the bottle cap, but on the bubble wrap, I've used the darker purple with some lighter purple and then just a touch of white. So again, it adds interest. Having same colors when it comes to stamping can be not as interesting. So it's an easy way to add visual interest by not having to add a lot more steps. And so for the sequin scrap, I like to use a really dry brush. Again, put the paint onto the palette, dip the brush in, and then stamp the brush around a little bit just to get a really good coverage. You can see there that the bristles are actually sticking apart. It's not so damp that the bristles are clumping together. And like with any stencil, we want to hold it down firmly with one hand, start in the middle, and then slowly stencil our shape onto the background. Again, adding a little bit of paint and then adding more if you find that it needs to be darker at any stage. It's easy enough to check. And again, one color can often be boring, so try one color, then add a little bit more of another color with a separate brush. And so these are our canvases so far. We've added a layer of gesso. In this case, we actually added the ephemera under the acrylic paint, but there's no reason why we couldn't put down some color. and then add some ephemera on top. Again, it depends on where you want it to sit in the painting. If you've got a piece of music or a particular phrase or a heading that you want to be a feature, then you might actually put that on top of the acrylic paint and then just use a little bit of paint around the outline, the outside of it, to help blend it in. So these are the things you want to experiment with, trying to put them in different places. We've then added some tissue paper, and you can see on the right-hand side there that the tissue paper has almost completely disappeared. So that's a combination of using the varnish, making sure we've got a really good adhesion, that it dries properly, and then adding a little bit more of the purple around it to hide it. Now, I can tell where it is because I put it there, but quite often, someone looking at your work, by the time you finish, the tissue really will fade into the background, just leaving you with that really solid image. Again, it's a much better way of getting a solid image than if you're trying to stamp it on, because we've got an uneven surface and it just doesn't tend to work as well. We've also used that same swirl stamp across the three to tie the series together, and then the bottle cap, the bubble wrap stamping, and the stenciling with the punchinella to give it some consistency. And our last painting step is to add a border to the piece. There's not many things I would do in mixed media art or even card making where I don't like to add a border or a frame of some sort. Quite often it might be in black or in brown, but in this case I'm just using the purple, so I wanted to make sure that we had done it with that darker colour. Meredith asked, do I have any good tips for getting a good impression for the bubble wrap? I think you need good bubble wrap that hasn't been attacked by children, so that it's got some good air still in it. And then again, just applying that little bit of paint on. It depends, I guess, what you mean by a good impression. I'm just looking for things that are adding colour in different places. So with the border, we use the paintbrush to add the paint around the sides and then let it just slightly drip onto the front of it. Again, the border helps finish off the piece, it helps frame it, but also it helps draw our eyes into the middle of the piece and helps that focus point really stand out. And now for my second funnest bit, starting to gather up all your embellishments. This is the time where you start to pull out everything that's in the colour scheme that what you're looking at for this piece. So whether it's the 10-2 Studios images, some buttons, some ribbon, some sticky bling, or some rub-ons, grab everything that you've got. Now I found at this point, as I was pulling everything out, because I was doing the three pieces in parallel, I was getting a little bit confused about what I wanted to add to what piece. So it got to the point where I just had to sit to a side and work on one at a time. Now I'm sure there's many different techniques for finding what works as far as embellishment goes, but the technique that works for me is to pull everything out, even perhaps open an unexpected drawer, and it's quite often amazing what you find that you'd forgotten about, and put all that information in there. And then sometimes you just need to step back from it for a little while. So whether you go and make yourself a cup of coffee, go out and check the letterbox, go and put a load of washing on, and see what sparks in your brain. Quite often there'll be one or two things that go, yep, that's the perfect thing for that one. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. Or what about that thing that I bought at that last craft show? I'm sure it was in that drawer somewhere. And then you go and fish those things out. So it's interesting the way that the brain makes those connections. But again, don't think too much about it. We've got to jump right in. So for our first canvas, I thought this image from 10-2 Studios worked really well. So the challenge is that we can't just guess. We have to take some steps towards using some of our stash to decide whether it's going to work or not. So I actually cut this image out from the sheet and then sat it on the canvas. And I was really happy with the match of the girl's purple coat to the purple that I'd used in the background. But quite often just putting an image like that onto the canvas is not enough. We need to help lift it off a little bit. So for this case, I then laid it onto some white card and then some black card. And I stuck these together with double-sided tape. I then used double-sided tape as well to stick the image onto the background. Now those little swirls there were actually rub-ons, and I thought that was a really nice way of finishing it off. So again, not introducing a new colour, but using a white and putting it on that black background. So that swirl comes from the American Craft Mini Marks, Elegant Book 2, as well as the word lovely. Now the thing I really like about the rub-ons is that it gives you a much better impression than if you were trying to stamp on it. It's a bit less risky at this stage than trying to add some more tissue paper because we're kind of over that stage. We've passed the messy stage. And it also lets you put something on that looks good, but also allows the background to shine through. And I think that's quite often the challenge in mixed media art is that we've put so much work into this wonderful background and we've got all the colours and the textures and the ephemera and the stamping that we don't want to cover it up too much. So while we want to finish it off and add some embellishments to pull it together, we don't need too much, or else we tend to lose those beautiful backgrounds that we've spent all the time creating. For the second canvas, I really struggled with these diagonal lines that I had originally put into the gesso. I tried to put on some ribbons, some buttons, some lace, but across the diagonal it was all too much. It was quite large considering they're fairly small canvases. So I decided in the end, I took a deep breath, got out a gold gel pen and ruled some lines. I tell you, it was a couple of minutes of taking a few deep breaths because it's one of those steps that once you get started, you're pretty much committed to it and you don't want to look back. So I used the ruler and followed the lines that I already had to create some diagonal lines. I then also realized that I hadn't really added any gold into the piece. So I got my sequin scrap back out and just used some Brilliance Galaxy Gold ink to stencil a few little bits here and there to help pull it together. I had originally written the word believe into the gesso, so I used the gold gel pen just to highlight that again. Now, the challenge with using gel pens in your mixed media art is that sometimes they don't dry very well. So for these ones, I did make sure I heat set it. And then after that, I sealed it with a layer of spray varnish. Now, if you don't have spray varnish, I certainly would recommend it as something to have on hand because it is extremely handy for your art journals and for your canvases. But if you don't have it, and you do have either the gel medium or the Mod Podge or the varnish in a pot, is to still apply that, but just do it really gently with the brush rather than sort of putting a layer on as we normally would with the paint. Just dab the medium onto the lines, and then as it dries a little bit, smooth it out. That way the lines don't tend to smear so much. Again, if you're going for something that's a bit smudgy in your mixed media art, that's fine. But usually I get a little bit cranky when I smudge those lines, so I try to make sure that we seal them. And then, of course, we need to let that dry properly. So because I wasn't going with anything diagonal here, I decided to go with something a bit different. And I apologise for that middle picture. It is a bit blurry. But what I've used in this case was some Tim Holtz grunge board. And this was the stripes elements. And I've gone for the heart. Now, the great thing about things like the Tim Holtz grunge board is that it comes in a neutral colour and it's easy to paint with our same acrylic paints. There's nothing more frustrating as when you go and buy embellishments and then you come home to match them with something and they've used such obscure colours that there is nothing that it matches with. And in a way, that was what propelled me into this foray of mixed media art. I was so sick of going to buy scrapbooking embellishments that you then had to buy that brand of paper with that brand of album, with that brand of ribbon, with that brand of buttons, with that brand of everything else because you couldn't mix and match the colours with anything else. So I decided that that was just a marketing ploy to get more money out of us. There had to be a better way to express our own creativity without giving them all our money. So the great thing about things like the grunge board or any sort of chipboard is that we can use the paints we've already got to add the colours and we know that it will work on the final piece because it's the same paint that we've used all the way through. Oops. So I painted that with firstly the lighter purple in the middle. And then I added the dark purple around the outside and then a little bit of gold and white in the middle with a dry brush. So that's another technique, is the dry brush technique, just using it to highlight those stripes. I've got a couple of questions. I'll come back to those in a minute. So once the heart was dry, I wrapped it around with some of that washi cord, which is almost like a wire covered in purple, and then I adhered that to the background. I did use dimensional glue to stick that down, and it does have a bit of a drying time, but I was just concerned with the thickness of the wire under the heart is that it wouldn't stick anywhere else. I probably also could have used some double-sided foam tape, but I just tend to find that sometimes good old-fashioned glue is the best way to go. I then sat some heavy weights on it just to make sure it would stay in the right place. And that was our second canvas finished. For our third canvas, we already had the tissue paper image on it, so I didn't want to cover that up at all. I really wanted to use that and highlight it and use that as the theme of the piece. So the first thing I did was added some credit card lines. Now, for those of you that may have a steady hand, perhaps you could add those lines with a paintbrush. But as I said before, I tend to be a bit of a bull at a china shop when it comes to mixed media art painting, and I don't have the patience to find a thin brush and do it slowly. I want a method that gets the paint on there thick, quickly, that mostly does what I need it to do, and then I can repeat it over and over. So using an old store card or a credit card, I use a paintbrush to add a little bit of the darker paint onto one of the edges, put it carefully down onto the canvas, and then drag it in the direction that I want the lines. If I find that the paint's run out a little bit, I'll come back and touch it up and then give it another go. And it's a really good way to create parallel lines because you just then repeat the process and moving the card off a little bit. So here across the top and across the left-hand side, I've added some credit card lines to give it a little bit of a frame and again to draw your eyes back into the image and into the word. So of course our artwork needs a word or a phrase to finish it off. And here I wanted to use my rub-on letters. So these are Making Memories Rummage in large white. When I first bought white rub-ons, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do with them. But I found they work really well in mixed media art because if we've used dark colours in the background, they really do stand out and help convey that message that we want to in our artwork. So again, sometimes we might need to take a big breath, but we do need to cut the letters out, and then that allows us to place them onto the canvas in a few different ways to decide where it looks best. Most of these will have a bit of a backing on them, so cut that out as well, and then you're not worried about the letters sticking. So if you change your mind, you can sit them aside and use them another time. When we rub these on, I usually start in the middle and then work your way out. So you've got a pretty good idea that the word's going to end up straight with the right spacing and pretty much where you want it to. The great thing about white lettering is if you're going for something that's a little bit more grungy or a little bit antique, you can still use the white lettering. Just get a stencil brush with some sepia coloured or some light brown ink and use that to put a little bit of the ink over the white lettering, and it will make it slightly more off-white, which will blend much better into your background, whether you're doing something more grungy or steampunk or vintage. So the white lettering is actually very versatile, certainly more versatile than I thought it was when I first bought it. So that was the end of our third piece. And so there are our canvases together. So if you've got any questions, you're welcome to type them into the question pad. Firstly, I've got one here from Barbara. Do I have a recommendation for double-sided tape to adhere to the bumpy painted canvas? I find that I just have, can I find it? Where have I put it? This is just a double-sided express tape. It's about 5 millimeters, which is what, an eighth of an inch. But I will put a whole heap of sections on the back of it. And I find that that's usually enough. If it's just a light image, that'll quite often be enough to hold it. If it's something a little bit bumpier, or if the canvas has, more of the impasto medium underneath, so it's really rough, then I probably would resort back to the gel medium. That just helps fill in those little craters a bit and make sure that you've got a good bond. So is grunge board the same as chipboard? Well, being Tim Holtz, probably not. His selling point with the grunge board is it has an extra bit of tooth to it, so you can add quite a bit of extra material, an extra paints and whatnot, and it doesn't actually fall apart. Having said that, the feel of it is slightly more, I don't know, what would you say? Almost fabric-like, almost like a thick canvas. But if you can get hold of it, it really doesn't matter whether it's that or chipboard. It will still work the same as far as adding colours go. And of course, you don't necessarily need to buy the punched out shapes. You can just get the material. Or of course, there's our cereal box cardboard, which will work exactly the same. And you can draw your own heart or your own star or whatever it might be. We certainly don't need to have all these pre-purchased things. And of course, I don't use them because I don't want to waste them. So I have them sitting there taking up space. But at least this one got out and got some use. So I just wanted to go back to Meredith's other question about the good impression for the bubble wrap. What I had underneath the one here was actually a wooden mounted rubber stamp, and I just had used the back of that to kind of make a little bit of a stamp out of. I've also used perhaps an ink pad or something with a flat surface, and putting that bubble wrap on it makes it a little bit more manageable. Were there any other questions? I've got a question here from Jane about the acrylic paints. So I'm using student acrylics, not necessarily the cheapest ones from the local shop, but usually that medium price range from the art shop, usually somewhere between $2 to $5 a tube. I don't actually own any of the really expensive golden paints. It's absolutely on my wish list. But at this point in time, I'm just happy to collect colors and use the ones that I've got. You find that if you buy really cheap acrylics, it tends to have less pigment in it and doesn't tend to blend so well and gets a bit watery. So having said that, if that's all you've got, or whether you can borrow them from the kids, then that's fine. And watercolor paints, you can do a similar sort of approach with it, but it won't always work out exactly the same. So these are the things you might need to experiment with. And that's why you don't have to jump straight into a canvas. You could just use your cereal box cardboard or your art journal to experiment. So Jasmine asked, what paint pens or pens do we use? So the ones that I used in that middle piece are the Pentel Hybrid Gel metallic pens. I've also got a couple of Sharpies as well, but I don't tend to use the gold Sharpies. I tend to just stick to the gel pens. It doesn't necessarily give you the best coverage. You do need to be quite slow when you're ruling the lines, but if you're patient with it, let one layer dry and then go over it with the next layer, it's usually enough. Again, if you're looking for something that's really solid and clear, then perhaps gold is not the best color to use. Go with a black Sharpie pen. And again, I'd still heat set that and then put a layer of varnish over it, just so we're not risking it running any further as we add these extra layers. I mean, there certainly is no reason why you couldn't go and add some more paint at that point, but I find there's just a point where you've just got to stop. It just gets a bit crazy. Okay, how are we going for time? We're doing well. I know it's getting close to midnight in New York, so I do apologize. So I want to be able to help you guys get started in your mixed media art. And over the last 5 years, we've certainly put a lot of effort into researching what works, what doesn't work, and who's doing what. So what we've done over here at Mixed Media Art, we're very excited to announce that we've actually put all these techniques into a book, and it's now available for buying, for purchasing. In our Creating Layers in Mixed Media Art, we've combined these techniques that we've talked about today, as well as a whole heap of other ones, and talked about the tools and materials that we can use to create these layers. So like I said at the start, our aim really is to ensure that we don't spend a lot of money on these techniques, that we use what we've already got around the house, give ourselves permission to play. The book also includes 2 complete projects from start to finish to go through each step of the mixed media art process. There's nothing that frustrates me more when you see a finished piece and it might give a bit of an indication of how it was made, or in some of these apprentice magazines where it promises to show you how they're created, all the tricks behind the scenes, but all you end up is with the final image or item of artwork with photos taken from different angles. That doesn't help me. I need to see the process. I want to see what's involved. So when we talk about step-by-step at mixed media art, just like our mixed media art technique sheets, we mean step-by-step. Every project has the first step with an explanation as to the materials we've used and the technique we've done, as well as a photo that goes with it. So particularly for us visual types, it's much easier to look at the photos than actually bother with what the words say. So our first project is on a larger canvas board. This is a 10-inch by 12-inch board, and we've done it here in a range of blues. So hopefully you can identify some of the different layering that we've used there. We've got some gesso with some words scrawled in it. We've got some ephemera. We've got some found object stamping. May even be the same bubble wrap and lid that we've used on these other projects. Also, to build up this heart, I've used some impasto medium, which is like a really thick glue that gives us an ability to add some fantastic texture. If you're just starting out, it's not one of the things you need to run out and grab straight away. Though if you have a chance to play with it, I'm sure you'll have some fun. We've also used some stenciling there, some rubber stamping or foam stamps, and then some journaling as well. So Jan's just asked what is my favourite white pen. The one that I used in this project, let me see if I can find it, is a Uniball Signo, and that's the broad one, white. So what I will do is add a full list of things that we've used to create these pieces on the website with links to them as well. So for those of you that want to hunt them down, that'll be the easiest way to go. So like I said, step-by-step instructions showing you this is what we've used, this is how we've done it. This is when we can push on and add some more layers. This is when we need to stop and let it dry. And then also other ideas of how we can use similar techniques and processes. Our second project is an art journal in an altered book. Now, for those of you that are using altered books as your substrate for your mixed media art, it's always a good idea to actually start with that layer of gesso. Firstly, it helps to make sure that the layers of acrylic paint will stick to the shiny surfaces, especially if it's a big, glossy, hard-covered book. But also it helps cover up that text in the images that we don't want to be part of our piece. So again, we've used some gesso, some ephemera, some impasto medium. So here we experimented with putting some under the layers of paint and putting some over the layers of paint, and to see the different effects that we've got. And again, it goes through step by step, showing you what it looks like when it's wet and then what it looks like when it's dry. Oops. Sorry about that. And finally, my favorite part of the mixed media art book is our handy What's Next guide. I don't know how many times I'll be sitting at my art desk. I've got paint out. I've got paintbrushes that are wet. I've got wet credit cards. I've got wet found objects, all sorts of things. And I know it needs something else, but I'm just not sure what's next. That was the driving force behind putting this What's Next guide together. We've taken all the materials and tools that we've used across the techniques in the book and shown you different ways that we can use them. So if we're looking at gesso, not only do we want to put that in the background, we might be able to use it for a resistance technique. We could use it for credit card lines. We could use it as dry brush to add some texture to the top. Or we could use it as a wash to help consolidate all the colors. So the What Next guide really does help us when we're up to our elbows in mess and not sure what to do. So by following through, it gives us some ideas. And sometimes it's just that little seed that we need planted in our brains to spark off some other ideas. And I've got a question here from Jasmine. What are your favorite brand names? You'll have to let me know which products you're talking about. If you're talking about the mediums, I tend to buy the Matisse ones. A lot of the ones that you can get in America that are reasonably priced are really expensive to buy here in Australia. So we just tend to use some of the local homegrown ones, and the Matisse ones tend to be the ones that are a really good product at a reasonable price. So to thank you for being part of our community, of course, we'd love you to buy our book, but what we wanted to also do is to thank you by giving you a set of our mixed media art technique sheets. So some of the ones that we've already covered today is how do we get the issues onto the tissue paper. We talked about the credit card painting. We've also got here some of the basic techniques to get us started, as well as a couple of projects to inspire you. So when you buy the book, send me an email with your receipt in it, and I'll have our email address up here in a minute, and I'll send you a copy of these bundles. So while you're waiting for your book to arrive in the post, you can download these 10 technique sheets immediately and get started. And again, when we say step by step, we mean step by step, outlining all the materials we use, all the tools we use, and then a blurb and a photo for each part of the process so that you can replicate it at home. If you've already got our mixed media art bundle, still send me an email and let me know that you'd like to wait for the second bundle, which will be out in September, and we'll send that to your email straight away. Yes, Jasmine was saying for mediums and varnish. So I use the Matisse brand. And again, that's just what the teacher who taught me used. So whether it's better than any others, I think when we find something that works for us, we tend to stick with it. So I'm very pleased to announce that our book is now available through Amazon. Now, most of you being in the US, it will certainly make it easier to get it from Amazon because they don't deliver to some other places in the world, believe it or not. So I've added in the chat a link that will get you directly there because these things can be a little bit hard to find sometimes. So if you go to mixedmediaart.net/creating_layers_shoot3, it'll take you straight there. Now, the great thing, of course, about Amazon is that when you've got a couple of items, you tend to get free delivery. The delivery is fantastic. Even all the way to Australia, they tend to be very reliable. If you're somewhere else that Amazon doesn't service, then send me an email and we'll talk about what we can do to help you out. Now, there is another alternative. So this book was actually independently published through Amazon's publishing arm, which is CreateSpace. Now, the great thing about CreateSpace is that I'm allowed to influence the price, which I can't actually do inside Amazon. They set the price. They decide when they're going to discount it. But I'm able to offer you a discount for the Creating Layers book in CreateSpace. So I will add in the URL for that. And then what you also need is this discount code, which will give you a 30% discount off the book. Now, that'll also be repeated in the follow-up email from this session. So if you don't have a chance to copy those two URLs now, or write them down, or cut and paste them into a Word document, then that'll be coming to your inbox in the next day or two. So the great thing about independently publishing is that I've been able to put whatever we wanted into this book. No one could tell me that it needed to be bigger or shorter or less photos or whatever it was. It was the way exactly that I wanted it to. Though, of course, the challenge with independent publishing is that I don't have a team of people behind me that can promote the book, that can do the book signings, that can organize it all. So this is where I need your help. Could you please go across to Amazon, add the book to your wish list, and leave a review? Let other people know in the mixed media art community how mixedmediaart.net really does bring mixed media to the masses for those of you that want to create and don't always know where to start. Now, for those of you with blogs, with Facebooks, with Twitter accounts and craft groups, please share the word and then let me know how you've done that, and then you can go in the draw for winning one of these 3 canvases. And I'm sure we'll have more than just these 3 prizes in the end as well. So make sure everyone knows about it. Tell people why it's important to give this a go, to get some basics and understanding of these tools and techniques, and then just dive in and do it. I'm amazed at how frequently I will get emails from people, usually in their late 50s, that say, I always felt that I wanted to be creative and I was told that I wasn't artistic, that I couldn't draw, that I couldn't paint, so I didn't do anything. But that need to create just grew and grew until they got to a point where they had some time on their hands, a little bit of money, a little bit of space, so they wanted to give something a go. And that's why I think mixed media art is the perfect craft for someone who wants to be creative but feels that they can't draw or feel that they can't paint something properly. Because we're creating abstract backgrounds, we're using colors that we like. We don't have to worry that it doesn't look right or proper or real. And we're doing it for ourselves. We're not doing this for our partners. We're not doing it to sell our work. We're doing it because it makes us feel good. There's nothing like being in that moment where you've got the canvases there, you've got paint everywhere, you've got some stuff stuck in your hair, you've dropped the ink pad onto your pants, that's a different story, and you're just having fun. You might have some music on, you might be listening to a podcast, and you just feel alive. You can feel the brain coming up with some great ideas. Your hands are working and pulling these pieces together, and it's exciting. It's what makes us feel alive, and I have no doubt it's what will keep us young, because if we have a passion, then we can never grow old. So like I said, I need your help. Please add a review to Amazon, talk about it on your Facebook page, share it on your blog, then let me know where you shared it, and we can go into the draw to win one of the canvases that we've created for you today. So for those of you with Amazon accounts, if you could go across and find the book, so it's at mixedmediaart.net/creatinglayers_shoot3. And for those of you that are approaching midnight, I completely understand if you leave that for the morning. And then add it to your wish list as well, because that's another way that Amazon looks for ways of promoting the book. And then in Australia, we've got Mother's Day coming up, so it could be a perfect thing to add to your wish list. So rather than getting a cold cup of tea and a soggy piece of toast for breakfast, I'm sure a copy of Creating Layers and Mixed Media Art would be a much more appreciated gift. So we've talked today about ways that we can bring these layers together. So I hope you've all taken something away from this. I want you to just go get started. Use what you've got. Use your kids' paints. Use cereal box cardboard. Use the old magazines or newspapers that you have lying around, and just get creating. Experiment with it. It doesn't matter if it's a canvas. It doesn't matter if it's an art journal. It doesn't matter if it's an art journal without journaling. Sometimes that whole writing thing just seems to make the whole painting process more complicated. So I want you to let everyone know that we're here at mixedmediaart.net. If you've got any questions or comments, then please send me an email. And I'll also be over in our Facebook page. So that's facebook.com/creatingmixedmediaart. You'll find us there, and we'll continue the conversation over there. So thank you all for coming, and happy creating. Good night.